Hello, my name is Roisin, and I have my work cut out for me. Hello friends, and welcome to my channel, or welcome back if you have been here before. Today's video, I am assuming, is a very long one, and is my reading challenge for the month of March, which, I can tell you now, has spilled over into April. If you have been here before, you will know that I have done a different reading challenge each month, and I've done a vlog for those. I will leave my playlist of those vlogs in the cards above if you would like to go and check out any of my other reading challenges I set myself over the course of this year. In the UK, there is a prize called the Walter Scott Prize, which is a prize for historical fiction that comes out every year. A few years ago, they put together a shortlist of 10 best historical fiction books, and the general public voted for which was their favourite. The winner of this was Wolf Hall, which, as you may know, is one of my favourite books of all time. And so I decided, as someone who loves historical fiction, to read all 10 of these books. So I would know what is considered popular, but also like literary prize-worthy historical fiction, and maybe find some new favourite books. There were 10 books on this list, but as I mentioned, the Wolf Hall was one of them, and I have already read that. The Luminaries was also on there, which is another one of my favourite books, but I have, of course, already read that. And then, as well as that, there were 2 books by Dorothy Dunnett, who is a Scottish historical fiction writer from the middle of the 20th century, the sort of 60s onwards. And one was the first book in a series, and one was the last book in the same series. And that was called Checkmate. And I decided not to read Checkmate because why would I read the last book in a series without reading the intervening books? It seems strange to me. So I have to read 7 historical fiction books. The only problem is, on top of the fact that I normally only read 5 books for my challenge, these books are rather chunky. It seems to me that the Walter Scott Prize likes a long historical fiction book. So I definitely have my work cut out for me because this is like 3 times as many pages as I normally do for one of these challenges. As I have already mentioned, Dorothy Dunnett is one of the writers who had 2 books on this list, and I am reading the first in her Lyman Chronicles series, The Game of Kings, which, not to be confused with Game of Thrones, is just historical fiction. There is no fantasy elements here. As I already mentioned, Dorothy Dunnett is a Scottish writer, and this is a piece of historical fiction set in Scotland during the reign of Mary, Queen of Scots, but when she was very, very small. And it tells the story of Lyman, who is a Scottish nobleman who has been banished from Scotland because they believe that he connived with the English against them in a previous war of Scotland. So he's a traitor to the Scottish. And so he has come back into Scotland, and he is kind of a pirate, kind of a renegade lord, returning to Scotland at the time when King Henry VIII has just died in England, and the lords who are regents for Edward VI are trying to get him married to Mary, Queen of Scots. And so there is conflict between the English and the Scottish, and it seems that the idea of Scottish and English conflict is quite a theme in this list, because we also have The Eagle of the Ninth by Rosemary Sutcliff. This is a piece of children's historical fiction, or YA historical fiction, written in the 1950s. And this tells the story of Marcus, who is a Roman centurion whose father disappeared in Scotland when he was a young boy, and now he is in the Roman army in Britain. He ends up in the north trying to find out what happened to his father and venturing into Scotland. And then also another book that's on the list is Waverley by Sir Walter Scott. So this is by the man, Sir Walter Scott, after whom the Walter Scott Prize is named, and is considered to be the founding piece of historical fiction in English. It's the first kind of historical fiction novel. Of course, we have Shakespeare writes histories, but those are plays. This is kind of the original novel and was written in 1804. This tells the story of Waverley, who is English nobility, whose uncle is a Tory and on the Jacobite side, but whose father is a Whig and on the Hanoverian side. And this tells the story of the 1745 Scottish Rebellion, and it is about Waverley, who joins the English army, but ends up being kind of intrigued by Scotland and the Scottish people and their cause, and their Bonnie Prince Charlie, who they're trying to put on the throne. So this is a piece of historical fiction set 60 years before it was written, but is also a classic, being written 215 years before now. But also being a way to look at the way that people in the early 19th century viewed their more recent history. It's almost like people today writing a Second World War novel. Right, so aside from those 3, which are all about Scotland and England, we also have one of my favourite writers of all time, A Place of Greater Safety by Hilary Mantel. So as I've already mentioned, I love the Wolf Hall trilogy, but I've never read anything by Mantel that isn't about Thomas Cromwell. This is her hunking great piece of work about the French Revolution, and she here is talking about Georges Danton, Camille Desmoulins and Maximilien Robespierre, and it is following their lives throughout the course of the French Revolution. Again, the French Revolution is not something that I've ever studied in history, so I don't know a lot about it, and I am excited to be drawn into Mantel's beautiful, consummate writing and her real she excels at scene setting and like time period setting and making you feel like you're really drawn into a time period. So I'm hoping that this will be similar to Wolf Hall in that respect, although this was first published in 92 and Wolf Hall is later. It's definitely later, but I can't remember exactly when. But yeah. Then we also have another small theme within this section is the sex worker theme. We have Michel Faber's The Crimson Petal and the White, which is another huge one. Doesn't look as big as A Place of Greater Safety, but is actually 100 pages longer. It tells the story of Sugar, who is a late Victorian sex worker. Broad cast of characters, and we follow Sugar and her relationship with William Rackham, his wife and brother, and his brother's relationships, and it's kind of a almost Dickensian in the way that it's written, although set much later and much like more sordid, steamier than I would imagine Charles Dickens is. The novel that Dickens might have written had he been allowed to speak freely. So anyway, another Victorian sex worker, we have Tipping the Velvet by Sarah Waters, and this Sarah Waters is famous for writing lesbian historical fiction. She describes them as lesbian novels, and this is her debut, Tipping the Velvet, which is about a girl called Nancy who sells oysters in Whitstable but is obsessed with music hall and ends up going into music hall and then also becoming a sex worker later on. It's just the story of her life. It is just a novel of one person's life and her journey through this, but it is an exploration of what Victorian life would have been like for queer people, specifically queer women, and what that history that is often left out of history books and of historical fiction. So I know people love Sarah Waters, which is one of the reasons I'm excited to read this. And then finally we have A Days Without End by Sebastian Barry, which when I read this list didn't realise was by an Irish author. But this tells the story of Thomas McNulty, who has fled, had to leave Ireland because of the famine, and ends up in America signing up for the army and fighting in the wars of expansion against Native Americans and also in the Civil War. Blurbed by Aravinda Diga, Ali Smith, Donald Ryan, Kazuo Ishiguro. The strength of his writing is really well known, and this was longlisted for the Booker in 2017. So there we go. This isn't even all of them. I have one more book than this on my list of books that I have to read this month, so good luck to me if I will actually get through any others, who knows. But I will roll the clips and you will see how well I've done. Hello and welcome to Roisin Looks Like a Laundry Lady in her vlogs. I think I'm going to start with this because my reasoning is this is a children's book, which means to me it will be a quick read because it will be written for children. There are some illustrations. The satisfaction of having finished a novel, completed a novel, will be really helpful for me. I feel like this is the one I'm going to like the least. I have a feeling I'm going to understand the height of all of the others, with the exception potentially of Waverley. I might love this, I might not. Classics can be a bit hit and miss for me. This one is the one that's like the wild card that I know absolutely nothing about, but I'm intrigued by. So anyway, this is the one I think I'm going to like the least. I'm not really an adventure story kind of girl. I feel like it's going to be very plotty, not particularly beautiful writing and character driven, but who knows, it could be. Hello, so I am about a third of the way through Eagle of the Ninth now, so I'm actually reading a book, and I am enjoying this. It's definitely much more plotty focused than character focused or lyrical writing or anything like that, as you would expect from like YA, but like old-timey YA. They definitely wrote more complicatedly in YA in the 1950s than they do now. Not to say the literature was better. The one thing is that there is this 13-year-old girl in it, and I'm hoping that she's just going to be friends and she isn't being introduced as a love interest, because that would be creepy. I like how in the Eagle of the Ninth, I thought I'd mention this here in case I forget my wrap-up, the dialogue is written in a way that reminds me of when I studied Latin at university. Like, is the syntax is Latin almost, not all of it, not like Catullus Latin, but I think more close to maybe she knows Vulgar Latin, and it's closer to that. I never studied Vulgar Latin, so I don't know. But it is kind of set up as Latin would be in terms of syntax. That makes it feel Roman without having to do too much in terms of description or language. So I'm enjoying that part of it. Do you make them welcome while I tend to their horses and the fruits of my hunting? He's not asking a question. That's just the way of phrasing that particular sentence because of the tense it's in, which is a tense we don't use in English. The Eagle of the Ninth. There have been very few women so far in my reading. I probably need to get to the Sarah Waters if I want some women in my reading. And of course, everyone's very, very white, and I think that's going to be true for the whole thing. But this book is definitely a boys' adventure book, a daring book for boys. If you've ever seen Michael Palin's Ripping Yarns, I feel like this is the kind of book they were taking the piss off. I realise that that is like a highly specific take. My dad was hugely into Monty Python, so I've seen a lot of the like various Python things, including like Time Bandits when I was definitely too young to understand what was going on. But regardless, this is a book that is kind of the best that it could be for what it is. So it is an adventure book where it is very much about like male relationships, the relationship with his father, the relationship with his uncle, the relationship with this Briton who he buys after seeing him in a gladiator contest, and then they become friends and he frees him. And they go off on this adventure together. I don't think that's really a spoiler. Maybe that is a spoiler, but anyway, I think that it's the best for what it could be for what it is. So I can understand why this came onto this list of favourite historical fiction, because I feel like a lot of boys probably read this when they were teenagers or when they were like younger than that, like probably between 10 and 14. I feel like this would be really aimed at. The writing is really good. I really felt into it. There was some beautiful description, but mostly it was plot. This was definitely a very plot-based book, which is not usually my preference, but I think that it worked quite well in here. I like the way she talked about like Roman society and also Britannic society, pagan rites and things like that, and also Roman rites. There was like the Mithras cult and stuff. I think it was all done really well integrated into the story, so you don't feel like you're just being told history, but you're actually feeling the story. And I felt like the characters were pretty well developed, but that was secondary because this was really focused on the plot. I don't think it's going to be one of my favourite books ever, or that I'm going to continue on with this series, but I do think that if that is something you were into and for a grounding in Roman Britain, this works really well because the story is engaging enough that you will continue with it, but I think it is also quite accurate in regards to Roman Britain. I have a classics degree, but Roman Britain was not my specialty, so if there are huge inaccuracies in this, I apologise. But I did feel like, yeah, it worked pretty well, and I can see why it becomes beloved of people. There is a little bit of strangeness between Cottia, the girl, and Marcus, the guy, because I'm not sure of the ages of this. She's definitely described as 13 in the beginning, but several years take place. He would have had to be at least 17 at the beginning, so I feel like there's a bit of an age gap going on, but then Roman Britain, would that have been that weird? I don't really know. She was also, like, just a prize. It felt a bit like she was a prize. Admits to never having thought about whilst he was away, but when he gets back he's like, no, I want it now. So I did feel like that was a bit weird, and there's definitely, yeah, women are completely unimportant in this. It's all about men, and it's a very masculine book. Despite having been written by a woman, it's a very masculine book, but that could be, yeah, in part due to the time period it was written as well, because it was written in the 1950s. Hello, so I have been listening to The Game of Kings, and I'm about 20% of the way through now. I've had to re-listen to the start about 3 or 4 times because I was getting really confused. I couldn't remember what had happened, who was who, and I don't know if that's because I was listening to it at the same time as listening to Waverley, which are both set in Scotland. But I think I've got my head around it now, and I kind of know who everyone is and what's going on. And I'm enjoying it. It is, I like the writing. I think the writing's really charming. So far it's just been a lot of adventure and it's comedy, like it's quite funny, which I wasn't expecting, but I am enjoying. And I like Lyman, the main character. He is a rogue, but a fun one. So I think that's good. It kind of reminds me of things like The Three Musketeers or something like that. There's a lot of criminal stuff, but in a really funny way. Hello, so I finished Game of Kings last night and I really did enjoy it. I thought it was a really great romp of a book. It was really, really fun, but there was one character that needed more justice. She needed a better storyline. She was fridged. and I didn't appreciate it. I'm not going to tell you who it is, I don't want to spoil it too badly, but she was one of my favourites, and I'm sad that she was fridged. It's like if Game of Thrones and The Three Musketeers and Pirates of the Caribbean had a child and it was set in the 16th century in Scotland. Also a bit Ocean's 11-y. There's no heist, but there's this like gets himself into trouble, but really he's not in trouble because he set the trap himself, but the other people didn't know, and so he gets out, but then he's still in a scrape, and he has to give himself up because of his honour. It was very much like a romantic swashbuckly kind of a book. I feel like swashbuckling is only associated with pirates. I don't know if you can swashbuckle on land. I don't know if swashbuckling is sea specific, but he definitely Francis Crawford of Lyman feels like a swashbuckler, a romantic, a flirt, very clever man. There's a lot of references to chess. I really, really enjoyed it. I was a little confused because Dorothy Dunnett does not care if you know nothing about the history, does not care if you don't speak French and Latin and German, does not care if you don't know a lot about 16th century Scottish poetry. She'll just reference and quote her way through everything, and you're like, I'm confused, but also I enjoy it. So it wasn't my favourite book, but it's definitely one that I think I want to reread, and in physical copy, because I feel like I got a bit confused. As to who everyone was, I felt like I was my mum watching TV programmes and being like, wait, who's that again? I don't think it's going to be one of my new favourites. That's why I've given it 4 stars. But maybe if I reread it, or if I got really into the series, it could be, because this is a big series. There's a lot going on. And I definitely think it would make a really fun TV programme. Despite being written in the 60s, unlike The Eagle of the Night, it had some really strong female characters, some really good, interesting women involved. There were like 3 particularly good female characters that I thought, 4 actually. One was evil, but good. And I really thought that the characters were really, really strong. So I will probably read the rest of the series at some point in the future. It didn't quite have my preference in terms of, like, my favourite books, I really feel like need something extra where I feel like I've worked in a way. There's something I've talked before about feeling like instead of I'm watching something, I'm really engaged in something. And whilst I did to a certain extent, this felt more like a fun comfort book than like one of my favourite books for the other reason. But really well done for that type of book. And yeah, I would recommend it if you are at all interested in really dense historical fiction. Not dense in terms of dry, just a lot going on. Hello, so I am not very well today. I have read about a quarter of Tipping the Velvet, and yeah, I'm enjoying it. I think it's good. It's reminding me a little bit of like David Copperfield, and I don't know if that's because time period or because of the way it's like being told to me directly. It is as if Nan, the main character, is telling you a story. So far I'm enjoying it, but it feels very frothy, and I feel like that means something bad is going to happen in the future. These are the nation's favourite historical fiction, so they're all going to be good books. Like, I don't think I'm going to hate any of them or have anything to whine about like I have in my past 2 versions of this. But it is nice to be reading a book that's more about women than the other ones and is queer. That's a new thing compared to the other books that I'm reading for this, because it's very much men and military is what has been so far. Game of Kings is very much men and military, but there are some women characters and they are really interesting and good women characters, particularly the mother and Christian Stewart. I find them to be good characters and I'm glad they're there, but it is still very like military focused. It's nice to read something that isn't that. Hello, yes, you may be able to tell that this clip was filmed directly after a different clip, but I've decided to organise by books this time for this vlog, so we'll see. I am about 60% of the way through Tipping the Velvet by Sarah Waters. I am enjoying this book. It definitely has Dickensian tone to it, which I enjoy, but like a sexy Dickens. I am enjoying the way that it's engaging with the darker, like seedier aspect of Victorian England, although I do think it feels a little bit clean and a little bit safe compared to maybe my prejudice or my understanding. Like, she's not got into a lot of trouble despite some of the things she's been doing. There's not been a lot of peril or danger. It's just quite fun and I'm quite enjoying it. Again, I'm not sure it's going to be one of my favourites because I feel like the writing style very conversational, very much being told a story, but there's not a lot of beauty in it. And I don't know, I don't love it as much as I hoped that I would. I thought that this would be like one of my favourites and I'd be obsessed with Sarah Waters, and I'm enjoying it, but I'm not quite there yet. I've still got 40% of the way to go, so there's a lot that could happen between now and then, between now and when I'm finished, that could draw me into it a bit more. I feel like maybe the fact that it's not quite, it had so much hype is doing it damage, and I would enjoy it more had I not thought of it as such a like hypey book. But I will finish it and then get back to you. Hello, so I got my vaccine today. Can you see that? No, I don't think you can tell. But I think it's triggered a migraine. So I'm not feeling the best, but it could just be a migraine for any other reason. Anyway, I finished Tipping the Velvet a couple of days ago and I haven't talked to you about it yet. So I liked this book, but I didn't love it. And I'm not really sure why I didn't love it. Like, it was a fun romp. There was a lot going on. It was like it travels through Victorian London, very much on the style of like David Copperfield, that very Victorian, like a life kind of thing. But this was very like lesbian London. Like, it was about music halls and then playing mashers, so women dressing up as men on the stage. There was sex work in here, and then also like really posh lesbians, sapphic women, and then like what it would have been like for more working class people. Like, all of that was explored through the life of Nancy, who is the main character in this book. And I liked that, and I thought it was a lot of fun. It was very funny in some parts. However, I did feel like the writing was just fine. Like, there was nothing special about the writing. It didn't get in the way. It didn't do anything that super annoyed me, but it also wasn't very beautiful or lyrical, which is my general preference. And then also I felt like the ending was really like easy. Everything felt a little like too straightforward in terms of the plot. There was nothing special about this book for me. I guess maybe having lesbian historical fiction just in and of itself is what is special about this book, but the actual story, the writing, none of that felt particularly special or interesting. Like, the subject matter was interesting, but it wasn't done in a particularly interesting way. It was just a straightforward story, which is fine, but is not my preference. Like, I don't prefer books that are just a straightforward story. I always want more from my books than that. And then also, I think it's kind of forgettable, which feels really bad to say about like Sarah Waters. Like, this is a pinnacle of historical fiction, but for me it didn't work. This is her debut. This is Sarah Waters' first novel, and so I definitely think that because it was so readable, because I found it so engaging in that way, I want to give Sarah Waters' other books a chance. And maybe perhaps this is not the perfect Sarah Waters for me, but that doesn't mean I can't enjoy Sarah Waters, and that maybe I would prefer Fingersmith or some of her other books. Readable, enjoyable. I understand why it's super popular, but whilst it was good, it didn't capture me in the same way. Now, I have also begun The Monster, A Place of Greater Safety. Actually, only the second biggest book I'm reading, though it looks bigger. I am about here, so I've read part 1 and part 2, but I haven't got any further than that yet. So about a quarter of the way through, I guess. Yes, it is lovely to be back in Mantel's hands, back with her writing. It's actually not that dissimilar in terms of writing style to the Wolf Hall trilogy, but I love that style, so I'm not complaining about that. It's much wider, much broader. It's much more characters and more intrigue. Like, it's less specifically inside one person's head as the Wolf Hall trilogy is. There's a lot going on, so it's more like, sometimes it feels like a play, which I really enjoy, and there's bits of like quotations at the beginning of stuff that's historical. There's a lot of like facts in here. It's also interesting to read this one about the French Revolution compared to reading about Thomas Cromwell, because although I didn't know a huge amount about the Tudor period, I know what's going to be the fate of Thomas More, Anne Boleyn, Thomas Cromwell, Thomas Wolsey. I know what's going to happen to all of them, whereas in this I actually don't know, apart from Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI. I know what's going to happen to them. The rest of them I don't know. So it is kind of interesting to read it without having the historical knowledge perspective. But yes, I am really loving being back in Mantel's writing. Just feels cozy because I know I can trust it, but it's a lot more plotty, I would say, than Wolf Hall and The Mirror and the Light. It's more along the lines of Bring Up the Bodies in terms of how plotty it is. But in terms of it being like a broad cast of characters, that is different. And it's also really witty and funny. And I'm enjoying that aspect of it. There's like the asides and the way that she understands characters and makes you laugh at character. It's kind of Austen-like in a way. Yeah, I'm enjoying that. So I am now here, and this is as much as I had in audiobook form. The rest of this I'm going to have to read physical copy, so I'm just under halfway, but it's the point of changeover for me. I'm really enjoying it, but I don't currently like it as much as the Wolf Hall trilogy. So the Wolf Hall is very much focused on Thomas Cromwell, and we have the Tudor court, and there is a big cast of characters, but we're very much inside Cromwell's head, and that is something that I really like about it. This is 3 men. It's the story of 3 men and also 2 women, and also there are some other men. It is a wide cast of characters. I feel like this is an ensemble piece, and so it is very different from Wolf Hall in that respect, but I am enjoying it. And also I think that any of the dramatic irony is completely lost on me, and I feel like that is something that Hilary Mantel did really, really well in the Wolf Hall trilogy, because I knew which of the major players were going to get their heads chopped off, whereas in here, apart from the king and Marie Antoinette, I don't know who else loses their heads. So any sort of foreshadowing is completely lost on me, and would take a rereading for me to truly get that aspect of it. So 2 parts of the stuff I love about Wolf Hall isn't in here. What is in here more than Wolf Hall though is comedy. Like Wolf Hall is witty, but this is so much funnier and wittier. It's almost like a farce a lot of the time. It is so ridiculous. It's like all of the major characters are comedic in a way. Like she is gently mocking them. It's almost Austen-like in that way. Like if Jane Austen wrote about the French Revolution, I feel like it would not come off too dissimilar to this, which is really not what you would expect from reading the Wolf Hall trilogy, but I really like it. I really like how funny it is and how witty and how we're just mocking absolutely everyone involved in the French Revolution. I can really get on board with that. I have finished A Place of Greater Safety by Hilary Mantel. I made it. It was a long slog, but I did it. So I don't like this as much as Wolf Hall, but I do like it. This came out before Wolf Hall. The first third is really, really funny, and the last third is really, really tense, and the middle third drags a little bit. She did a really good job of making sure that I knew who everyone was and introducing them the right amount the next time, so it wasn't like, I know this, but it also wasn't like, wait, who's that again? But it's written in a really interesting way, where sometimes it's direct quotes from them, sometimes it's a script almost, and I feel like she uses the script when she's actually making it up, like when it's private conversations that there could not possibly be a record of, and then sometimes it's direct address it's in first person, like I Desmoulins or whatever, say something, and then but a lot of the time it's in third person, and sometimes she breaks the fourth wall. I don't know if you call it the fourth wall in fiction, but talks directly to us as the narrator, as she does in Wolf Hall. Hey look, we've had to move arms. And so you can see a lot of what she was doing that eventually made it into Thomas Cromwell. But I feel like what I loved so much about Wolf Hall, it was a lot slower. This covers 10 years. 10 years? Basically, it covers 6 years, but also it covers their childhoods and stuff. But anyway, I feel like a lot quicker, a lot of stuff happens, and I feel like that's in part because this follows 3 main characters and also a lot of side characters, whereas Wolf Hall is really, really focused in on Thomas Cromwell. And whilst there are side characters like Wolsey and Anne Boleyn and Henry and Thomas More, who are all important, it's not quite as split as this is. We know about the family of Robespierre and Desmoulins. What's his name? Danton. So we know about all of their families, and it's a lot more in depth, but it's a sort of farcical, epic, political intrigue. There's a lot going on. It's very, very clever. The ending, I was I looked up what happened, but I mean, you can't really, it's not spoilers. It's 300-year-old history. I looked up what happened to them all, but still at the end I was like, no, why do you have to kill Camille, my poor Camille? And she did a good job of making you switch allegiances all the time, with who you felt was being in the right, and being very nuanced. There was a lot of nuance in it, and everyone felt really human, which I always think is one of Mantel's strengths. But yeah, I think I preferred the focus on one person in Wolf Hall, but it's an unfair comparison because you know how I feel about Wolf Hall. Hello, so I have started Days Without End now. I have read a quarter of this so far, and this is set during the well, currently it's before the American Civil War, but it says on the back there will be American Civil War stuff in it, and it is about Thomas McNulty, who fled Ireland during the famine. A whole family died in the famine, and he fled to Canada and then into America, and now he's like fighting for the American army against Native Americans. There has been a lot of slaughter in this already, like a lot of really brutal descriptions of things, descriptions of the famine, descriptions of basically people being not treated as human. So like Thomas McNulty as an Irishman was not treated as human when he was in Ireland, and when he as a refugee in Canada, the treatment of the people around him and the things that he's seen, he wasn't treated as human, and now he's kind of participating in the treatment of Native Americans in a dehumanizing way as well. It's really, really beautifully written. It's written kind of in dialect, and it's very run-on and very colloquial, very spoken word. Because it's written from his perspective, he's talking to you. It definitely feels like being told a story. But it is really well written, and it is also involves a gay relationship, which I'm sure is going to be developed a bit more, because for the moment we've just been going quite quickly through everything. But yeah, I think it's really, out of all of the ones I've read so far, I feel like this and A Place of Greater Safety are the most beautifully written. I would say this was more literary than Eagle of the Ninth, Game of Kings, Tipping the Velvet. This is more literary than any of those. And I'm enjoying it quite a lot. And I am halfway through Days Without End now. I'm enjoying it, I am, but it is very literary, and lots of traumatic things happen, which is makes it quite a slow read. There's quite a lot that happens in it. It's quite plotty in that way, but it's not really about what happens, I suppose, except for as much as it's about the trauma inflicted on people who have been colonised, and the dangers of that, and also irrepressible human spirit of Thomas McNulty. It's about them being part of the expansion westwards and the brutal attacks on Native American people during that. You're seeing their complicity, but also their poverty and their being part of this machine, and it's quite an interesting portrayal that way. Like, you don't feel like they're doing the right thing or anything like that, but you feel sympathy for some of the people involved because of how little other choice they had. I haven't quite thought through what I'm thinking about, but yeah, it's making it quite a difficult read. And on top of that, it's very lyrical writing, which is writing that you always have to take slower, but there's so much in it that's like really, really beautiful, really, really well written, and there's parts that I really want to like underline or keep or quote forever. So I'm really, really enjoying that aspect of it. Spring comes into Massachusetts with her famous flame, God's breath warming the winter out of things. That means something to 1,000 boys hipped into camp at a spot called Long Island, outside the old city of Boston. Except the endless yards of rain as thick as cloth that falls on us, battering the tents. But we got new business with the world, and our very hearts are filling with the work. That's how it seems as we set out upon our war. Hello, so it's been a while since I've spoken to you, although it won't seem like that to you, obviously. But I have finished Days Without End, which I read most of in a vlog, which I will put in the cards above. But I finished this now, and I am really conflicted about this book. And it's about also his relationship with John Cole, handsome John Cole, as he calls him, his life partner, and the Native American Sioux child that they end up adopting together. And it's about that relationship, and also his relationship with other men involved in the war. It's an unflinching look at war, unflinching look at the atrocities committed in the name of colonialism, and it does talk about how it seems strange to Thomas McNulty that people who had been considered less than human in Ireland are now treating Native Americans as less than human and perpetuating atrocities against them. Like he mentions that Oliver Cromwell said he wanted to clear out Ireland of the filthy vermin of the Irish and replace them with good Christians to make a paradise on earth. And that is similar rhetoric to what he's hearing directed at the Native Americans. It is very beautifully written, incredibly beautifully written. The writing in this is stunning, absolutely stunning. Takes a while to get into because it is very almost dreamlike and colloquial at times, but also very descriptive and beautiful. Just such stunning metaphors. You can tell that Sebastian Barry has written poetry. There is definitely something very poetic about the writing in this, and I loved that. And although there is unflinching descriptions of famine, of prisoner of war camps, and of atrocities committed against Native American people, there is also a lot of hope and joy in the spirit of Thomas McNulty and in his relationships. This also deals with, I keep saying Thomas and his, but it does talk about their gender identity and intimations that she might actually be a trans woman, although obviously there is not the language for that in the 1860s. But I'm not an Own Voices reviewer, so you'd have to seek out a trans reviewer for better understanding if that is good representation. So all of that is really positive, really good praise about this novel. The thing that I feel uncomfortable about, though, is the treatment of Native American people by our protagonist. Now, our protagonist never dehumanizes Native American people in the way that other characters in the book do, but he still is part of and commits the atrocities. I understand the nuance that is being put forward here, and I understand the point. However, I remember reading in Bad Feminist by Roxane Gay how black people's stories are often only palatable to white people when they show black suffering, and I felt like there was something very similar about the treatment of Native American in this book, about how it is all about suffering. Particularly Sioux in Native Americans, they're not noble savages or savages. That's not their portrayal. It is more nuanced than that, but it is all very much their suffering as seen by a white person, and it's not that I'm saying that that's wrong. I just don't know how I feel about that. I couldn't find any Indigenous or Sioux reviewers to talk about this book and the portrayal in here, but it did feel uncomfortable that they take a Native American child and she becomes their own, and I didn't know how, and separated from her own people. And I didn't know how I just don't know how I feel about it. I haven't had time to sit with it or think about that, but that is the main thing. So I can't rate this yet. I feel like I need to sit with it and think about it and read stuff about it, I guess. But the only bad review I found of it so far is by someone from The Spectator who just doesn't like when there's queer people in stuff. That's all his other reviews are about. So I don't think that is what I'm going to be listening to. And part 3 of me sitting in this position dressed like this. The Crimson Petal and the White. I have begun it. Where am I at? Yeah. So, very, very early on. I am, we will say, roughly 100 pages in to an 800 page epic. So, an eighth of the way through the book. But so far, I'm enjoying it. Really raunchy. Like, obviously it's about sex workers, and I knew that going in, but I did not really expect how raunchy it is. I guess it's like Fanny Hill? Is that the 18th century sex worker novel? I haven't read it, but I saw a TV programme of it, and that was, yes, very raunchy as well. Yeah, I'm enjoying it so far. I like the tone of the narrator. So it's written in like the second person and then also the third person. So there are parts where she's, well, I say she because the audiobook, I have the audiobook as well, is a female actress, but unknown narrator is talking directly to you about your meeting these characters and like floating around. Something Dickensian about it too, but that could just be the setting, as in the time period, and dealing with working class people in the Victorian era, and a big cast of characters. This is funny. Again, this is really funny. So far. Well, I guess funny is not quite the right word. It's not like laugh out loud funny, but it is silly and witty and everyone's being skewered. Much like I said with A Place of Greater Safety, there is a lot of humour in it. It's very witty and sharp. Different though from the one I was going to compare it most closely to was Sarah Waters. I'm preferring this so far. There's something more to the writing, I think, than Sarah Waters. That was a first novel though, so I won't say Sarah Waters in general, Tipping the Velvet specifically. Hello. So now I am halfway through The Crimson Petal and the White, and I love this book. At the moment, I love this book so much. Like, sometimes I'm unsure how I feel about how much sex and like really explicit sex stuff there is in here from a woman's perspective when it's written by a man, because sometimes it feels a little gratuitous. I'm not entirely sure, but then sometimes other times it doesn't, and I quite like that aspect of it. Like sometimes it feels really tongue-in-cheek and funny and or like visceral and gross, but sometimes it doesn't, and so I'm just a bit torn about that aspect of it. But I think that the characters are done really well. I think it's really, really funny. I can see some of the aspects of like a Victorian novel that it's like mimicking, doing a good job of that, but in such a different way. I just want Sugar and Agnes to be friends. I want Sugar and Agnes to be friends. But I don't know if that's going to happen. It's very, very plotty. Like, that is the one thing that I'm noticing about this series, this challenge video, is that all of these books are really super plotty, except potentially Days Without End. Days Without End, I feel like, despite the fact that there is a Mantel in this, Days Without End is the most literary of all of these. They're all well written. None of them are bad writing, but they are all a lot more plotty than I prefer my books to be, generally speaking. I think that this one, though, is also really character focused. There's a lot of stuff about character in here. Like, the characters are really well developed, and feel really real, and I love what he's talking about when he's talking about like the treatment of women in terms of medicine. I think he's doing a good job of that, because the history of medicine is something that women's medicine is something that I have read up about, and I think he's doing a good job of portraying that in that way. It reminds me a little bit of The Essex Serpent by Sarah Perry, though, so I'm sure she was influenced by this. Hello, happy Easter. This video is taking me way longer to film than I intended. It was supposed to go up, well, it was supposed to go up last week, and then I rejigged my schedule and it was supposed to go up today. Obviously not going up today because I haven't finished the last book, but I have just finished The Crimson Petal and the White by Michelle Faber. So, thoughts time. There are some aspects of this I really like. I think it was really well written. I think it was really sumptuous, and I felt really drawn into it. All of the characters were very well rounded. I think it did a very good job of balancing people's motivations with being able to see their weaknesses. William Rackham, I hated him, he's terrible, but I think that Faber did a really good job of talking about male ego and how ego can damage the people around you, and the power that men have but don't seem to accept that they have. I think it did a really good job of that. However, it was too long. I really do think it was too long, and I didn't think the actual ending was fine, but I was just like, for God's sake, why is this still going? It dragged, and also I feel like for most of the books in this video, there's a lot of plot. Everything is quite plotty, and I'm like, I don't hate plot, but I'm not a reader who cares about plot. Like, I can read this, most of the things in this book have been what like CJ from CJ Reads called good plot, good writing. Like, they've all had very good writing, very beautiful writing. I'd go as far as to say Sebastian Barry has some of the best writing I've ever read. It's incredibly beautiful, but everything is very, very plotty, and for a while that can sustain me, but for 900 pages I'm just like, please, I am done. I am done. I don't need any more. And I feel like, I don't know if because I'm reading this as the second to last one I've finished, that's why this one has felt like it dragged the most, or if it's the fact that it is actually the longest book out of all of these and does not have as much scope as the second longest, which is A Place of Greater Safety, which had more substance to it. I understand all the literary allusions. There's a lot of allusions to like Jane Eyre, and the Brontes are mentioned in this, and there's allusions to the way that Victorian society took the truth and the grimness of Victorian society out of its literature, because the sort of notion of what was acceptable to print and what was morally good, there was a lot of censorship going on. This is kind of filling in all those gaps. Sometimes it felt a little voyeuristic, but I don't know if it was trying to be super matter of fact, but I don't really need to know about child's vulva, things like that. Like, I'm not a super prude if it's about adults, but about children I just feel a bit grim. Like, there was a time where it felt appropriate and a time where I just felt like, but I suppose it was being seen through the perspective of Sugar, who had been like sold into sex slavery by her mother from a childhood, so like that was kind of her perspective, and that's why there was so much sex in it. But I felt like it just kind of missed the mark in a couple of places, and most of all I just felt like it was too long. Like, I didn't need all of it, and it became chore to get through and a little unsatisfactory. I think the writing is really good. Eventually I felt like, you've made your point. Why are there 200 more pages? It sounds like a horror, like, oh, I hated this book, and I didn't. I think it's just because I've just finished it and I've just got through the slog part. It felt like a book with lots of ideas and lots of plot, but the plot and the ideas weren't married well together. So for me, whilst I did enjoy this, and it was a lot of fun, it was a good romp, there was too much of it. And maybe that's trying to read it quickly. Maybe if I'd given myself 2 weeks and listened to it slowly, then I would have enjoyed it more. And the final part of me like this, Waverley. I have begun Waverley. I'm about 20% of the way through now. Chapter 15 is where I'm up to. I'm this far through, although it looks further than I am because there's an introduction, and I haven't read the introduction. Because they spoil it. When you read the introduction of classics, they always tend to spoil the book. Kind of confused, kind of don't really know what's going on. It's written very differently from a modern novel. Like, the narrator is full on talking to us about his creative process and why he's writing stuff and why things have come in. And then there was a whole section with drunk Scots, like drunk 18th century Scots. I didn't understand what was going on. But Walter Scott is Scottish, so I didn't know that going in. He's writing a novel from the perspective of an Englishman, but going into Scotland during the Jacobite Rebellion. So that's interesting. Very, very masculine, which is not unexpected of an 18th century man. But I'm yet to be really, truly drawn in. So now I'm halfway through Waverley, and I'm quite confused by this book. I don't know if it's because it's one of the earliest novels I've ever read, but the way that it's written is so strange. The narrator keeps interposing himself really clearly, and for reasons I'm not quite sure. Like, there was a narrator in this, and I felt like I understood the point of that voice being about voyeurism and about seeing into someone else's life, and then the narrator interposes herself in a place of greater safety, but again that felt it was about this is fiction, and where does the line between history and construction lie in fiction, and that felt like the purpose of this. This voice just seems to be like, yep, this is a novel, but also I remember this time, and it's really strangely written, and a lot of references to writing of the time. The other thing that I struggle with sometimes with classics is that they assume you're a very educated person in the way of a like early 19th century educated person, so they'll just put in Latin with no translation, or French, or Italian, or in this case Scots and Gaelic as well. And I'm just like, can I have some help here? I'm a bit confused. And it's also, the tone is bizarre. There's a lot of like comedy and a lot of like romps and getting himself into danger in a really comedic way, and then the tone will just flip into serious. And there was random interpolation of Scottish poetry just thrown on the page in a way that just, it's very confusing. It's not at all like a modern novel, and I feel like I keep getting confused. I've had to stop listening to the audiobook and move to reading the physical book because then I get less confused. But sometimes I like to listen to the audiobook and just let things wash over me and go along with it. But this, it just seems to hop about so much that I'm really confused as to what's going on. That's my main thing. I haven't really been drawn into it yet, although there have been some interesting characters, I guess. The main character, though, barely seems to exist. It seems to be much more the narrator saying, our hero, but actual Waverley doesn't really say or do anything, which is quite bizarre. Yeah, I'm just mostly very confused by it. So I think I'm going to finish it, and I'm going to read the introduction and read a bit about it, and maybe I'll understand the point more. But it's definitely not a novel that I've fallen in love with. And it's written, like, it's published in 1804. It's not that different from Jane Austen, but it's a bit more confusing, a bit more slapdash, a bit more bits randomly pasted together. I'm just struggling to know what's going on. I feel like my brain's a bit burnt out on all this historical fiction, and I want to move on. But that is not where we're at right now. So fingers crossed. The rest of it, the second half, will be a bit easier for me, and there'll be more like stuff going on. Like, there's a lot of just random interpolation of history, and whenever a new character is introduced, we hear their whole backstory, which seems unnecessary, but there you go. I guess as it's the sort of first historical novel in English, like one of the beginnings of the tradition, it is done in a different way to a modern historical fiction. Hello! So, there we go. I was kind of pretending at the beginning of this to have not read all of the books, but I have. This is the end. I've got through all of them. So the only one that I haven't properly wrapped up for you yet is Waverley by Sir Walter Scott, which I just finished. So we'll start here and we'll work our way backwards. Waverley by Sir Walter Scott. I am glad I read this. I think that having read this has given me a real appreciation for some of the things that some of the other writers were doing in their historical fiction. The narrator very much talks to us throughout the novel, particularly the beginning and the end, but he interposes throughout to talk to us in a way to remind us which parts of this are history and which parts are taking liberties with the history. And I feel like that is something that happened throughout, this idea of a narrator to frame the subject. I don't think that he did as strong a job with that as some of the later books, but you know, he's writing pre-modernism, so he's not exactly going to be writing a postmodern novel. He is actually writing kind of towards the beginning of the novel as a concept, like the first 100 years of the novel he's writing, so there's a lot that's different from this, lots of poetry thrown in, and as always, classic authors think that if you are reading a novel, you must be educated and therefore must know Latin, and they don't need to translate it for you. Although the character that kept quoting Latin and quoting all these references that I didn't know was kind of a joke. It was kind of a joke that he was so erudite that he had to throw all this stuff in, but kind of embarrassed himself through that. This novel is a lot more comedic than I thought it was, but the trouble often with comedy that is not from the time period that you're in is not that we find different things funny now, but the form of humour is different. So the comedy will be about the same things, laughing at human foibles or a kind of farce going on, but the way that it's phrased, where the punchline falls in the action, is a little confusing for a modern reader. It's definitely not one of my favourite classics that I've ever read, and I don't think that I will continue and read all of the other Waverley novels because this is a massive series. I didn't realise that going in, but Ivanhoe is from the same series as this, although set a lot earlier, which is not one that I've read or at all. I just know of the classic movie. So it had a lot of the things that you would expect from being written by a man in this time period. The women were, you know, just prizes to be won, that sort of thing. And they had some character, but not a huge amount, which is why I don't often read male written classics. But it was interesting to learn a little bit about the Jacobite Rebellion, although also it was a little more dense than I could have preferred. About a third of this is written in Scots, which is a language I don't speak. And whilst you can understand most of it because it's fairly close, it's like sometimes I would get a little confused and a little trapped, and also it would go off in the weirdest tangents that I thought were entirely unrelated. You know, it's Chekhov, so sometimes there'd be a gun on the table and it wouldn't go off because why would they need that to happen? So it was a bit strange, but I'm definitely glad I read it in terms of understanding historical fiction more than for the virtues of this as a novel. So then if I'm going backwards chronologically, it was The Crimson Petal and the White by Michelle Faber, which I've spoken to you about fairly recently. Very beautiful writing, very sumptuous, very well developed characters. Loved the way that it talked about medical health and mental health and the treatment of mental health and the dismissiveness of women's health and the ways that men damage women without realising it, and the ego and the work that women do in order to placate men. I thought that was all really well explored in this novel. However, I did think that it was too long. It just went on for too long. I didn't need a lot of this. It could have cut out. And the ending felt a bit like not, oh, I'm ending this abruptly and unsatisfactorily for a good reason, just I've run out of things to say. Because I don't mind an abrupt or ambiguous ending, but it just felt a bit like, oh, I've kept going. Maybe I should finish now, rather than any real succinct reason for ending. Like, I don't need things to be wrapped up, but I feel like you could have ended 100 pages earlier if an ambiguous ending was all you were going to go for anyway. The thing that I was talking about with the narrator in this one was done to more success here, because obviously Michelle Faber is writing postmodernism, so he can do some of those things you expect with that, comment meta-narratively on the work itself. Then, what was the one before that? A Place of Greater Safety by Hilary Mantel. Again, too long. I'm not against a long novel, but I don't know if it's reading so many long novels all on the back of one another. Hilary Mantel did a brilliant job with the writing. It was really incisive and key, a lot funnier than I was expecting, funnier than Wolf Hall. This book is. There's a lot of farcical stuff in here as well, which I think is indebted probably to French farce and also to Waverley in that sense. There was the same thing. Again, the narrator coming in to show us what was fact and what was fiction in a way, or to at least make us think about the construction of the novel, why it would be constructed in that way. A lot of different ways of writing, like there were scripts in here, which I thought was interesting because the scripts were often used for like really personal conversations, whereas parts of speeches were also interpolated, but with like when and where they were said, which I thought was a clever way. Like, often people don't use speech marks because it's to like reinforce the fictitious nature of the book, but doing it as a script, as putting words into their mouth, and a script puts words into an actor's mouth, and I thought that that was a clever way of doing it, and also of reinforcing the way that acting is a really big part of this book, and your portrayal to the public and politics as performance was a really big part of this book. So I thought that that was an interesting way of writing it. But again, the middle bit dragged. Like the ending, no one does dramatic irony like Mantel. She's a genius of dramatic irony, and the setup great, and the comedy at the beginning, but the like third quarter kind of didn't need it. Remember the order that I read these in, but we're going to go with Tipping the Velvet. A lot of the things that I've noticed about this is that all of these are quite, not all of them, but most of these are quite literary books, particularly the last three that I mentioned and the next one that I'm going to mention, very literary books. This is literary too. It does have some beautiful writing in it, and definitely very good character development. I like the way that it's exploring parts of history that wouldn't normally get explored. But a lot of these books are really plotty in a way that I don't care for. I don't really need that much plot, and I feel like that's part of the reason that books drag for me, is because I would rather have a small slice of a life than then I did this, then I did this, then I did this. And that's what kind of let me down with this, is it felt very much like a churning onwards and onwards, and I was like, I'm done. Like, I don't need this much. I would rather sit down and have a conversation rather than continually keep going. I could see how this could be adapted really well into a film. I know there is a TV series, and I feel like it's very much got the action that you would need for that. I can't sustain an interest in a character for that long without there also being something interesting in the way that you're writing, in the form of the book, in beautiful writing, like poetic, lyrical writing, or saying something. Just say something to me, like give me a idea to digest. This just felt much like a story of a life, which is just not my preference. That's just not my personal preference. Doesn't mean that this is a bad book. It's just I wanted more from this. Days Without End by Sebastian Barry. Incredibly beautiful writing. One of the most beautifully written books that I have read this year. It is absolutely stunning in terms of writing. It's just gorgeous. And also is queer and is exploring parts of history that often aren't mentioned, and is talking about working class people in history in a way that Walter Scott and Hilary Mantel aren't. It is very much focused on these two men who have experienced incredible deprivation, and it is wrestling with the ideas of when a people like the Irish have been colonised and have been put through ethnic cleansing and then leave that country, and in order to find work end up perpetuating ethnic cleansing against a different people, and exploring the way that whiteness protects Irish people, particularly Irish Americans, which was all really fascinating. Putting queer people into these stories, exploring ideas of gender identity historically, because Sebastian Barry is not a trans writer. He's also not a Indigenous American writer. I don't know how I feel about the Indigenous rep in this book, because I think I mentioned when I was reading this about Roxane Gay talking about how stories of black people are more palatable to white readers or white viewers when they involve the suffering of black people. And this was very much about the suffering of Native American people, and put us on the side of the person perpetuating or participating in that suffering. And there's a particular scene where I just wished he would say something, but he didn't, putting us to sympathise with a coloniser. like a person who is perpetuating ethnic cleansing. Like, we're talking about the choices, the limited choices that Thomas McNulty has, but still he's committing these atrocities. I think it is very much, there's a lot to think about and a lot to digest in this book, and I couldn't find any Sue reviews or any other Indigenous reviews of this book when I looked it up, and I did look. It's not that I am saying it's a bad book, it's that I'm thinking about that representation and that aspect of this book and trying to still puzzle through it. Before that, I read The Eagle of the Ninth by Rosemary Sutcliff. This, I think, would be a fun book if you were 14, and particularly I think it ended up on this list because people read it as children, particularly men read it as children, and so it has that like resonance for them, was what interested them in Roman Britain, that sort of thing. Very pacey, lot going on, very much plot-heavy, plot-driven book. The characters are like non-existent, there's no real character in here, they're just cobble cutouts, but it's a children's book, so it feels unfair to view it in the same way, but then it's also on the same list, so we kind of have to give it the same critical analysis that we've given the other books. It's not very beautifully written, but it is written in a way that I wasn't bored, and it kept me wanting to find out what was going to happen, but it's a book that I read at the beginning, I read like 5 weeks ago and I've already forgotten. So I feel like it's not a book that's really spoken to me in any way, but it's definitely one that I think I would have enjoyed had I read it as a like 10 or 11-year-old, although there's no women in it. And then the first book that I read was The Game of Kings by Dorothy Dunnett. Yes, again, that one was fun. That one was just a romp, just a bit of a rollick, but again, I've kind of forgotten it. It was very compelling and I wanted to keep reading it. I did get a little confused in the beginning, as far as I remember, but it was a good fun book. Lots of plot. I feel like it could be a comfort, easy read though, because it's very clever, very well written, but fun, plotty book. But not one that's going to be my favourite book of all time, but kind of, even though it's not a romance, or it's a romance in the way of Walter Scott being a romance rather than a romance in the way of the modern view of romance, I kind of feel it as a similar position to well-written romance, like a fun, rompy book that I kind of wish they would develop into a like BBC HBO series or a Netflix series. I think it would do really well adapted and be really, really fun because it's funny and silly and active, kind of swashbuckling Pirates of the Caribbean vibes. Very, very fun. But doesn't have enough for me to sink my teeth into for it to be one of my favourite books. So there you have it. Those are all the books. I feel like this video has gone on forever and ever, so well done to you if you're still here. Give me some sort of historical emoji in the comments if you've made it all the way here. Is there a castle? If there's a castle, put a castle down there. Otherwise, please let me know what you thought of this video. I am really, really well done for sticking around this long. I think I've lost my mind, but hopefully it will come back in time for me to do this month's reading challenge, which again should be a little easier for me this time. So the thing that these all have in common is that they are pretty well written, but very, very plotty, and I don't need that much plot. And I think that it's interesting that the Luminaries was on there, because I feel like the Luminaries moves much more slowly than these other ones. Wolfhall, again, moves more slowly, but Bring Up the Bodies moves just as fast. What CJ from CJ Reads describes as good plot, good writing, all of these books kind of fall into that, and I think that's probably why they've become so popular, because most people need more plot than I do to read a book. They hate books where nothing happens. So that's why they get this following. But, you know, 2 of the books on the list were 2 of my favourite books ever. And one of these books, at least, had me really, really thinking. So I can see why they're all really popular. I'm definitely going to give myself a historical fiction break. I feel like my brain needs a rest from all of history. If you like this video, please remember to give it a thumbs up and to subscribe for more crazy challenges where I nearly lose my brain and feel it starting to leak out of my ears. Thank you for watching, and I will see you again very, very soon. Bye bye.